Hey y'all, welcome or welcome back as the case may be. I am so glad you're here. And today I want to respond to a friend who has asked me about organizing and why we don't just get out and organize. Those of us who are interested in seeing a strong labor movement. What I can do is talk about my experience as an immigration advocate, somebody who has been writing, has produced a documentary, and made multiple trips to the border. I've talked with numbers and numbers of experts, hundreds, in fact, of both experts who are experts both academically or experts because they've lived it. And so I can just tell you about my experience and suggest why I think a rush to organize can actually be counterproductive. So let me just start by saying my upbringing has an awful lot to do with who I am, and I'll go into detail about that later, but I can tell you that I grew up on contrarian thinking in terms of my culture, my church, and my government. So that it comes very naturally to me to question what's going on. And I think that kind of bled over into the organizing world. I got into immigration about 2005. And I had just graduated from Vanderbilt Divinity School, and an interfaith group was holding a meeting at City Hall, I believe it was, devoted to the subject of immigration, particularly illegal immigration or undocumented, however you want to put it. It was being held again by an interfaith group, and so my husband and I went thinking we might get some good information about why things are the way they are, or ideas on what we needed to do in terms of being responsible and being good to people. And so we went, and it didn't go at all as either of us expected. I didn't really say this, but I grew up in the civil rights movement. My parents were activists in Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, Alabama, and I grew up on that, and I've got a good feel for how people can get caught up and treat each other. But at any rate, I heard people saying in public things that they had not said about other human beings, and it was the public part of it that just shocked me, since I had been a kid growing up in the segregated South, and it wasn't just white people making these statements at the immigration meeting. There was a black man who stood up and said that he couldn't even rent out his property because of Mexicans running around half nude. Only he didn't say nude, and I'm afraid if I say the other word, I'll get banned or something. But I mean, that's what he said, with no sense of hesitation, no embarrassment, and nobody had a word to say. And then a man who's a medical doctor and was running for the Senate did his all shucks, good old boy thing, where he said, I'm just as confused as y'all are, but the thing that really worries me is that undocumented people could be bringing in leprosy. They don't have good health care there. And I was like, what? Leprosy? Really? A medical doctor? Really? Did anybody challenge him? Oh no, they broke out into wild applause, and the interfaith religious man who was hosting it just egged him on and said, looks like people want you in Montgomery, and all of this kind of thing. So I left, and my husband and I were just in shock, and we looked at each other and we said, "Has so and so, the moderator, has he lost his mind?" Um, and then I went to church a few days later, and a man who had been there spoke to me and said how good it was to see me there, that we just had to do something about this terrible problem. And I'm like, you assume that because I'm at an immigration meeting, I'm anti-immigrant? And he went on to say, you can't say I'm a racist, so forth and so on. Anyway, bless his heart. He wasn't a bad guy, but he was, that's what happened. So I thought, well, with my upbringing and all my education, by this point I had a PhD in U.S. history, and I had followed that up with a master's of theological studies with an emphasis on Latin America and liberation theology at Vanderbilt. So I thought, with my upbringing and all my education, if I didn't have something to contribute to this, then it all would have been wasted on me. And so one thing led to another, and I learned of a group called Border Links that operates out of Tucson that takes people on what they call immersion trips, beginning in Tucson and then going across the border into Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. And in the 5 days I was with them, I came back with a really good understanding of what was going on, what the causal factors were, and what the prices were that people were paying. I came back having been exposed to the impact of NAFTA on the countries on Mexico, and later on other free trade agreements on Central America in particular. I heard about a shocking federal program called Prevention Through Deterrence, which actually funnels undocumented people to their deaths, intentionally to their deaths, in the Sonora Desert. And at that time, the Sonora Desert was ground zero for migrant deaths. It has shifted a bit to Texas, but migrant deaths have been a problem, a real problem in California, Arizona, and Texas in particular. I visited shelters where people who were about to cross or who had just been deported or repatriated would come, and I got to meet some of them and talk with some of them, and got more information from the people who ran these shelters, who were extremely well educated about NAFTA, about aquifers under the communally held peasant lands, so forth and so on. I saw the militarized border. I visited Border Patrol headquarters. I saw the metal sheets being put up to make a wall left over from some of our wars. I saw the infrared cameras. I saw the stadium lights. I saw the police dogs. I saw human beings in distress. And I saw Border Patrol vans and cars in many, many, many side roads and on the highway, well above the 100 miles limit that they're supposed to operate in. And so when I got back to Alabama, I did extensive research, because even though I had talked to people who are on the ground in Tucson and other places in Arizona and in Nogales, I wanted to make sure before I went out on a limb that all of these things were true. So I did that. I did some investigating on my own. I did a heck of a lot of reading. I read the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so in about 2006, right after I got back from this experience, I wrote what was the first of my published articles. It was an op-ed published in the Mobile Press Register, and I gave it the title "The Color Line Has Come to the Borderline," and which is not unusual. The editor changed the title to something more obvious, which was illegal immigration, and I just wrote about these things about trying to get the information into a wider audience, and so then I also wrote a piece for the Huntsville, Alabama Times about my trip to the border, and that was followed up with a number of published articles in Patheos, which is a faith organization, Huffington Post, various newspapers, and so forth. Then I put together a PowerPoint, and I began getting invitations, and I took every invitation I got: churches, universities, so forth and so on. At any rate, I was invited by the American Association of University Women to give my PowerPoint, my talk. And at the end, somebody said, "You've got to find a way to reach a broader audience." So I had what was probably the most naive idea anybody ever had. I thought, well, I'll make a movie, which was silly. Not only because I had never made a movie, but because I didn't even have a camcorder to record my children. I barely took their pictures. I was usually just more about enjoying the moment than recording it. At any rate, in 2008, I went back to the border, and by that time, Martin Sheen had come on board as the narrator. And also, somewhere along the line, I began to interact with what are called migrant justice organizers, and getting somewhat involved in the organizations, going to their meetings, speaking, interacting on social media with other organizers in Alabama. And I realized fairly early on that there are real problems with organizers and organizations devoted to what is called migrant justice. Now, I want to emphasize and make clear that I put the organizers in Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee in a completely different category than organizers in Arizona, Texas, and California. And more about that in a minute, because our conclusions are completely different, or the conclusions of the organizers in these two areas are completely different. One of the things I realized is that, at least in Alabama, the organizations that you would normally be directed to were led by people who were not grassroots by any stretch of the imagination, not even to the degree that I am. And they were not people who had developed any real insight into the real issues, the causal factors, the push factors of why people come, nor what it means to come in the technical term without inspection, or to come illegally. These were not grassroots social justice people. These were what I call payroll activists. They were on a payroll, and it was not unusual for a person to be on a 501c3's payroll as an immigration expert this year, but next year be on another 501c3's payroll as a payday loan expert. This was not at all unusual. And the bottom line is that people really didn't know what they were talking about, and they didn't really care what they were talking about. So I can give you a few experiences of what happened when I went to meetings. This is, of course, after the interfaith meeting in Huntsville. So I went to a state, or actually a locally led meeting. It was led by a ministry organization out of Birmingham. And the immediate message was, we've got to organize. We've got to organize. We've got to go into the small towns and the big towns and the alleys and the highways and organize. And finally, I was already getting very frustrated with these organizations. But finally, I said, what exactly do you want to organize for? What would be the goal? What would be the message? And there was just complete silence. And a man spoke up and said, I don't even know what to say to people when they ask me, why don't they just come legally? Which I think is a fair question and a pretty widespread question. And again, there was silence. And I was beginning to make a horse's behind of myself, which I have continued to do, I'm afraid. I'm not very good at being both diplomatic and saying what I think. I said, well, I think that's a good question. And I actually know the answer to that question. Does anybody here know the answer to the question, why don't they come legally? And again, you could hear a pin drop, and it was like, what are you even talking about? Why is that question important? They're human beings. They're not legal or, all that. And I said, I know why they don't come legally. I said, it's simple. There's a simple answer to a basic question, which is that they don't come legally because the United States does not allow them to come legally. And I may have or may not have gone into title to land and bank account information. But to me, it was just a basic question. So we wanted to get out there and organize, but we didn't know answers to the most basic of questions, and we didn't care to. Nothing ever changed after that, as far as I could see. And then there was another meeting. There was an organization formed in the State House called the Joint Interim Patriotic Immigration Commission. And it was a fact-finding effort to find out just what people in Alabama want vis-a-vis illegal immigration. And I went to the meeting and was scheduled to speak. It was held at the Art Museum, and it is one of the few times in my life I've ever been so afraid for my physical well-being that I was literally shaking. And it was and I was thinking of finding the nearest door and making an exit and, just forget about speaking. But I have to say a hearty round of applause for the police who were there and just slowly made their way into the assembly, which I would say there were maybe 200 or 300 people there. And the room calmed down. And so after that, there were other meetings, one in Hoover, Alabama, one in Birmingham, and then one in Mobile. And we got word back from some of the higher level organizers in the biggest immigrant justice group in the state that they were so encouraged by the meeting in Mobile. It was just all about how the employers just love their brown brothers and what good workers they are. And they mentioned some people. So I got online, and one of the people who had said, I'm just mom and pop. I'm a mom and pop shipbuilder here on the Gulf Coast, and I operate so close to the line and couldn't make it without bringing in people from India and places like that. And I thought, Now, these people, let's keep in mind, I haven't mentioned this, but the leaders of this group were lawyers, okay? Lawyers. I'm a historian and I know about research, but so do lawyers. So I thought, I'm going to look into this love that the employers have. So it took me about, 10 minutes on the internet when I found out that the man who had the mom and pop shipbuilding organization called Master Marine was not a mom and pop organization. It was, in fact, an organization owned by Sun Myung Moon and and his church, the name of which is escaping me. But this is not mom and pop. Sun Myung Moon, his personal worth, and this would have been back in 2008 or so, was $90 million. That was just his personal worth. So the idea that, first of all, that you're a mom and pop when you're held by Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church, is what it's called, the Unification Church, it's just a ridiculous claim to make. He also owned nearly every business in Bayou La Battery, Alabama, which is on the Gulf Coast. And then, what is doubly shocking is that people at the top of the immigration advocacy organization in Alabama who were, let me repeat it, lawyers, just repeated these claims without looking into whether they were even remotely true. Really? I'm sorry. I like to be part of groups and I like people to like me, but I cannot not tell the truth. That was baloney. And a lot of this wound up in my documentary called The Second Cooler, which Martin Sheen, I may have said, came on to narrate. But these are some of the problems I'm trying to point out with organizing. And then there was, then there are the tried and true talking points. And so I got a telephone call one afternoon, and the voice on the other end identified himself as being with, and I had heard his name before, with one of the bigger national organizations called America's Voice. And I went to their website, and when you looked at their reason for being, their their reason for being, it said they wanted to pass a comprehensive immigration reform package. That's it. Nothing about the content of the package, just get one passed. And buddy, they did a good job of getting people to think the way they wanted them to think. And so he was talking to me and he said, we need somebody to be the voice of immigration advocacy in Alabama, and your name comes up repeatedly, and we wonder if you would be interested in that. And I thought, well, that's, I thought I already was doing that, but I'm willing to talk with you. And he said, well, here's what you have to do. And I stopped right away because I do my own thinking and I do my own speech writing. I do my own talking, and nobody's going to give me talking points that I have to stick with, especially, as he went on to say, you have to say, they only take jobs you don't want. And I said, well, I don't believe that to be the case. I believe that was a talking point of the planter aristocracy in the Old South. I believe that is a talking point of employers today. I'm not going to say it. And he says, well, maybe you're not the one for us in Alabama after all. And I said, I think you're right. So, it, so I need to get back before I forget it to comprehensive immigration reform. So they wanted nothing more than a comprehensive immigration reform package to get through not only the House of Representatives in Washington but the Senate. And so there was one put out there that all of these organizations got behind, not only America's Voice, but these organizations in Alabama. I think I'll hit the pause button there and come back to that in a second, because I have some other things that I think may be more important to get in there first. For one thing, one of the problems with the organizers and the organizations, and there are exceptions. There's a group called Adelante, which is a workers' center in Birmingham, and they provide legal representation for undocumented people and others too, I think. But I'm not talking about them. They are not the most well-known organization by any stretch in Alabama. So the motifs, first problem, they were payroll organizers and were not really invested in finding out what the causal factors were, nor what immigrants go through when they have to cross a border illegally. They were more interested in fundraising, and that is basically what they do. They ask for money at every turn. So they sounded more like, and were closer to being employers and business people than they were to being advocates. So you only take jobs. They only take jobs you don't want is just factually inaccurate. As I pointed out in the second cooler, I did interviews with a number of organizers, and one of them was a black man who organized in the poultry plants, which are notoriously horrendous, abusive, horrible places for both chickens and human beings. And he said it just makes it so difficult when we go in to try to negotiate with the owners of these chicken plants. And he was with the Wholesale Retail Department Store Workers Union. When the employers know they can just go out and get undocumented people who are not going to report them, who will work for substandard wages, who will work without any working conditions, good working conditions at all. So that motif was just plain wrong. I heard other advocates, and one in particular, another minister who was more interested in being, I think, morally correct than actually learning the issues. And he literally got up and said, they don't sneak across the border. The border is porous. They just walk through. And I'm like, what? What? Do you not know the most basic condition for crossing the border illegally, which is that it's horribly dangerous, it's humiliating, it's costing people their lands, their bank accounts, they go into debt with loan sharks. What are you talking about? So that's wrong. And people would say, oh, but they're just the hardest workers ever, which is not wrong. I don't mean to say that it's wrong. That's not my point. My point is that Americans are not the laziest workers around either. And to make the argument that a person should be required to get up on a roof, as I have heard it said to me by one of these big advocates in these bigger organizations, who else are you going to find to get up on a roof in 110-degree weather. An American's not going to do that. A citizen's not going to do that. And I'm like, what kind of an argument is that? That was precisely the argument of the slaveocracy, the planter aristocracy, who that was the talking point. Who's going to pick all this cotton in this heat? If we don't have slaves, you gonna do it? You gonna do it? And of course they answer, well, no, we got to have people who will work hard. This is just bullshit. I'm sorry. This is just baloney. And then we got into the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which boiled down to we don't need to have anybody leading anything having to do with immigration unless they are native Spanish speakers, which on its face is a silly argument. There are a lot of Spanish-speaking people who speak Spanish as a first language who are racist, misogynist, sexist, warmongering, all the bad things that you can say about them. Not all, of course. But what this meant was that someone from the Dominican Republic who had been a citizen since birth and spoke fluent Spanish, and who came from the family of, say, a medical doctor or a lawyer, had never even had to consider crossing a border illegally, was somehow more well-suited than, for example, me or anybody else whose Spanish was limited at best. And then there was the motif of Democrats are better than Republicans. Oh, really? So it was Clinton who signed into being the federal policy of funneling migrants to their deaths of migrants being a part of the program. It was the desired outcome. Prevention through deterrence, he signed that into being. Doris Meissner cooked it up. He signed into being the North American Free Trade Agreement, which everybody knows is the precipitating factor behind so much of people leaving their homes and crossing our border illegally. Oh, and then let's talk about Obama. Oh, yeah, Obama, back in the halcyon days when everything was wonderful. Obama, under whose presidency 3 million people were deported, leaving behind some 5,000 children in foster care. His language and policy of returning unaccompanied minors to Central America, even though he acknowledged they'd be safer here. Then there was the report issued by the ACLU documenting the horrendous abuse of children in the custody of Border Patrol during his first administration, including sexual abuse, threatening them with death, threatening to put them in the river, running over them, just horrendous abuses. And then, of course, there was a small matter of Obama's regime changes, replacing the democratically elected president of Honduras, whose name was Manuel Zelaya, with someone that was more suitable, more favorable, more appealing to, for example, Dole Foods, on whose payroll was Hillary Rodham Clinton. And that, excuse me, that coup d'etat, which was illegal, it has been called being the precipitating factor between Honduras spiraling downward into poverty, which Manuel Zelaya was helping Hondurans out of with a pogrom on indigenous people, LGBT persecutions, femicide, and particularly a focus on trans people, whether they are trans or transvestite or however they would identify themselves, of being persecuted, killed, chopped up into little pieces, and their bodies thrown into ditches. But Democrats are better than Republicans. It's mind-boggling. So the talking point should have been the free trade agreements, right to work laws in Alabama, and the necessity of labor solidarity. We should have been talking about prevention through deterrence. We should have been talking about migrant deaths, which went from a recorded 3,000 when I first started going to the border to this past year when it's reaching 9,000. And people who watch the border believe it's closer to 3 times that. So what is 3 times 9? 30. What's 3 times 9? Is it 36,000? Anyway, you do the math because my brain is fried. The military, we should have been talking about the military militarized border and the named beneficiaries. And then, we should have been talking about the content of the comprehensive immigration reform package. And before I move on to that, I want to say there are also in these groups, the heads of them who are either unreliable or dishonest actors or are needy actors who are more interested in being part of a group than they are in telling truth. So, for example, one of them I had contacted about being my Carly, bless her heart, does not like a closed door. Anyway, I approached this one woman in a group about borrowing their 501c3 status so that people could make donations and get a tax write-off for it. And she was very rude at first, but I overlooked that and continued to talk with her. And I went down there to meet her. And as we were leaving, she said, one of the things they've agreed to do by way of their 501c3 status, I think, in order to keep it, was they had to share information useful to undocumented people. And they had put out a pamphlet called Welcome to Birmingham or something like that, in Spanish. And they said, we can't give these away. Would you take this trunk load of pamphlets to Huntsville and give it out up there? And I'm like, A, that's dishonest. That's your job. B, of what use would organizations in Birmingham be to people in Huntsville and environs? That's just that. No. And after that, I thought, if she's not going to be honest about her own 501c3, then I don't trust her to be my not sponsor, but to share the 501c3 designation with. And here's another example of why I say I don't think these actors are necessarily trustworthy or really about what they're doing. A few years ago, there was a raid conducted by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, in which they were just rounding up people who were illegal. They were showing up in gas stations, and it was a terrible situation. I got a call in the middle of the night one time, and a woman says, Miss Ellen, ICE is at the door. I don't know what to do. And of course, I mean, if you don't know what to do at that point, And she had left a message on the machine because it was the middle of the night and I didn't hear it till the next morning. So I approached the biggest organization and I said, I have been able to raise thousands of dollars showing my documentary, The Second Cooler. If you want to, I will let you screen the movie. And, with the idea that you will raise money to pay the bail and the bonds of these people who are being arrested left and right. And they said, well, I'll think about it. And then they said, well, okay. And I said, now there are certain restrictions. You have to charge for it and you have to advertise. You have to get people in those seats. So word got back to me about 3 or 4 days ahead of time. They had done no advertising, which I asked about. They were not going to charge people. What they were going to do was put in the DVD into a player in a room somewhere and say, you can go watch it if you want to. And I said, I don't think so. I know I can raise money, and the money is needed for bail and for bonds, and no, I'm not going to do that. My work is worth more than that, and the people that you say you advocate for are worth more than that. So, rewinding now to, they should have been focusing too on the content of that comprehensive immigration reform package. Oops, sorry, I caused it to jiggle. And nobody cared about it. So all you had to do basically was look at the title and kind of take it from there. The title of the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Packet of 2012 was the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act. So basically what it was, did it have about citizenship in there? Yes. Was that the primary purpose of the package? No. Was that the initial thing that was going to happen with the package? No. The primary purpose of the package was to fully militarize the southwestern border from New Mexico to California without any interruptions. That was the package that came out during the Obama administration, not Trump, Obama. So how in the name of God is a further militarized border in any way, shape, or form going to be good for people who are having to cross illegally, without inspection, undocumented, without papers? Somebody explain to me how that is a good thing. We need to be talking about demilitarizing the border, taking it all down. In that package, they had named beneficiaries. All the helicopters were to be Black Hawk, for example. So who's benefiting from this package? Clearly, it's the border militarization people. The other part of the Economic Opportunity Act referred to major extensions of the guest worker program, which, as I have said and tried to point out clearly, I hope in the second cooler, the guest worker program is nothing but an indentured servitude packet. You can call it economic opportunity all you want, but when you've got someone bound to a single employer who keeps the passport, who holds the visa, not the employee, who cannot go down the road and get a better employer if the employer turns out not to have the work or won't pay, or the worker thinks he's coming in to pick oranges in Florida, but in fact the employer wants him for sexual services. There's nothing he can do about it. He can't complain because he's too afraid. He's likely heavily in debt in order to pay his way to come to the job. and the employer's holding all the cards. So now there's talk about shifting it from, and that's called indentured servitude, pure and simple. It's a type of slavery, as the Southern Poverty Law Center's report on the package was titled "Close to Slavery," and indeed it is. So now there's talk of moving from indentured servitude to what is basically serfdom. In other words, you can change your employer, but you cannot change your occupation. You must work the land. And that's pretty darn close to serfdom, if you ask me. And so the citizenship part, yes, there was a pathway to citizenship, but, and this is so important to understand, full militarization of the border was the trigger which led to the path to citizenship. And how long is that going to take? And when will it ever be completed? You know, does that include the drones, the use of drones? You know, all the things that can develop. If they're still saying the border's not shut, it's still not protected, that ain't no path to citizenship. And at best, even if someone did get on it, you have to keep in mind, in order to get on that path, they had to turn themselves and their families into the very department that is oriented to deportation, and that is the Department of Homeland Security. No one else. And you could fall off at any time. It was rigged with exceptions and fees, so that, and there was no guarantee that you'd make it to the end, and no guarantee that your information wouldn't be turned over to the DHS. So anyway, this video has run long, but I really I've been wanting to do this for a long time, and I appreciate my friend that I've gotten to know from one of my favorite podcasts called Due Dissidents, which I highly recommend. It's hosted by Keaton Weiss and Russell Dobular, and again, I highly recommend it. They did me the favor of screening the second cooler. And so this is for you, girlfriend, and for anybody else. And if you've watched this to the end, well, then I'm sending you a big virtual hug, because it is long, and I don't know how to say these things in a concise way. Anyway, I hope you watched it. I hope tons and tons and tons of people watch it. And I hope people begin to understand that, should we organize? Yes. But do we have an obligation to know what we're talking about? Yes, 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 1,000 times yes. Or we'll do more damage than good. All right. Y'all take care of yourselves. Be good to yourself. Be good to each other. Remember that I love you. Even though I may not know you, I do have your best interest in mind. And I will see you later. Bye-bye now.